Rushanara.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I've got a few questions on large tax reliefs and foregone revenue, but before I go on to that, could you comment on the report by the Public Accounts Committee that and I appreciate it may not be directly your brief, but as an organisation it is relevant, that 9 billion in tax revenue was lost during the pandemic because 4,000 HMRC staff fighting tax avoidance were redeployed. At the time, and I appreciate you might not have been the witnesses, but at the time your boss was asked these questions by this committee, me in particular, about whether HMRC needed resources so that core business wasn't going to be undermined. It seems, and we were reassured that the resources were going to be provided both by government as well as the head of HMRC. But it seems it has cost the taxpayer £9 billion. And the report goes on, this is early May, the report goes on to show that between, there's a 32% fewer cases in 2020 to 21 than the previous year. We all recognise the pandemic was difficult, but this is stuff that could have been foreseen. In fact, it was highlighted, and yet we were reassured that all will be fine. What do you have to say to that?
So obviously during the pandemic we had to deliver, change our business to support individuals and businesses. Some of that was the CJRS and other changes to our business practices, support businesses. So, but and so that those people were taken off it. But those cases are still, if we have concern about a case from 2020, we can still investigate that. So it's not permanently lost to us. So we can go back and rework those cases. We have recruited additional staff. And I think we've given evidence before that the challenge with recruiting those additional staff is it takes time for them to come up to being fully productive. So we are recruiting additional staff. We are bringing them in. So we are seeing our revenues, our compliance yield increasing over time. The next set of numbers will come out with the annual report and accounts. So we are.
So what's happening with the 4,000 staff? How did they get returned quite quickly after the pandemic back to what they were doing?
I'm happy to come in there.
Sure.
So the 4,000 staff you mentioned. So when we needed to, we moved a number into the Taxpayer Protection Task Force, which was specifically in relation to the schemes and clawing back any money lost to error and fraud. Now those staff are moving back into business as usual work, which will still include.
When did that come back? When did they start coming back, and how many?
They have started moving back into business as usual compliance teams at the moment. So they are going back into business as usual work, but that includes still the ongoing work related to the COVID schemes themselves. So that is still being undertaken.
You mean the fraud that was committed, the 4 billion or so fraud?
Yes.
Okay, so we've got billion. I mean, I'm losing count of the billions that's been lost to fraud and avoidance and the rest of it. And there is a limit to how much the pandemic is an excuse by a government for tolerating fraud and loss of revenue when we desperately need that money. So what would be helpful, and we all very much appreciated what HMRC officials had to do during the pandemic to reorganise and redeploy to deal with the challenges at hand. But what was made very clear by this committee at the time on those virtual calls right from the beginning was we were concerned that you would be under enormous pressure given what you were having to do, and that other priorities were not deprioritised, and then we end up in this situation. So it's not like we didn't see it coming. So I suppose but we are where we are. I suppose what would be helpful for us to understand is sort of, I'm sure you'll be reporting to the Public Accounts Committee as well, is how much of that 9 billion you think, we've had some evidence on the COVID fraud, how much of that 9 billion and how much of the other just over 4 billion from my recollection, you think you can recover, you have recovered, and so that we can see the progress you're making, and where it's needed, this committee, along with Public Accounts Committee, can shore up HMRC where needed to ensure that the government is giving you the resources and support you need to be able to do your jobs properly.
No, so I'm very happy to sort of provide more of the details in writing. What I do know is that we are seeing an increase after the fall in compliance year. We are now seeing that grow back. We expect that to grow back over time. We expect, as those 4,000 staff become more highly trained, gain more experience, that we will see increasing yield, but I don't have the exact numbers.
Sure. Do you have, perhaps you could come back to us with some detail in writing, talking to other colleagues within HMRC that will be across some of the things that you don't cover. But do you have a sense of what you think you can recover from that 9 billion over what time frame, and what should we be looking at in terms of sort of loss that is going to be hard to recover?
So I don't want to say something here that doesn't stand up to scrutiny, but I think we are, as I said, that 9 billion, if there are cases there that need to be worked, they can still be worked. So in theory, we can go back and look at those cases. What we will always do, though, is look at the highest risk where we can get the most revenue. So we are looking at kind of what we can do. We are given a certain amount of resource, and you and the wider public expect us to get as much money in through compliance yield. So we will always pursue the cases that we think are the most likely to get the most money in. But we can write to you on the details.
Yeah, it would be really helpful to understand how you're prioritising that.
I'm happy to add in on the COVID error and fraud numbers in particular. The most recent statement to the Public Accounts Committee was that of the 4.5 billion associated with those schemes, so far to date, the teams have brought in more than 1.1 billion, but those numbers will be updated more formally in the annual reports and accounts. In terms of the wider numbers, as Jonathan said, we can write to you on that, but in 21-22, we secured an additional 30.8 billion in compliance yield from the work of the compliance colleagues, and that is an increase year on year as we get back towards pre-pandemic levels. And it is very much about applying our resource to the biggest impact to make sure we sustain having one of the lowest tax gaps in the world.
Sure. And who are the sort of people you catch when you're doing that? Is it?
There's a real range. So we see behaviours in the tax system through from error, failure to take reasonable care, right through to deliberate fraud, and indeed we have to criminally investigate a small percentage of the population. Around 95% of the population does pay the right amount of tax, and so our efforts have to be spread across those behaviours in the most proportionate way. As I mentioned earlier, we want to prevent non-compliance before it happens, because that is the most effective way for us to bring in the right amount of money.
That's not where you are with respect to this 9 billion and 4.5 billion. That's already happened. So. We're all looking at, some of the pressures society's facing. So we're looking to you to do what you can to recover that money, because that would help with some of the other pressures that, that we face in terms of supporting people who need support. You're in the front line in recovering that.
And so there's a number of groups and ways we look at that. Obviously, sometimes we have a separate sort of unit for large businesses. Sometimes that's around litigation. Philippa's area looks at the wealthy, mid-size. Those are areas where we focus. And then we have a large number of small businesses and individuals.
Just on that on litigation, in that report, court closures and reduced court capacity during the COVID crisis were blamed for, and understand that, partly for what's happened. But it is said that you're not expecting prosecutions to return to pre-pandemic levels despite courts reopening. Is that because there's backlog and pressure, or is there a way in which you can address that? Because obviously that's going to affect your ability to process cases.
It will depend on the nature as well of how we deploy our powers. So we do have criminal powers, but we also have penalties and those sort of approaches. So our approach is to use the right power. And obviously penalties can sometimes be a very substantial deterrent,
Yep.
And so sometimes we'll be using that. So it may well be a mix of capacity, yep, but also our overall strategy.
It won't be useful for deterrent. Won't be useful for recovery, will it?
No, but again, there are a number of things we are trying to do through our actions. One is get the money back,
yep,
and secondly is make certain that we avoid people doing it in the future through deterrence.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to get on to the large tax reliefs. So there are 9 reliefs which cover 20 billion a year, £billion a year. And given that they are so large and presumably integral to their respective taxes, how do you scrutinise their effectiveness, the effectiveness of such tax reliefs? Who would like to?
Well, so I'll probably pass to Jane to offer a bit more. But as I said, some of those large reliefs, as I said, I'm not certain are particularly contested as an idea. So, zero rating of food, as I said, I don't know if it quite meets your 20 billion criteria, but those are uncontested. So we would not put a huge amount of effort into those. What we would do is put more effort into where we think the most, where we can get most benefit from that. But Jane, did you want to say a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, I think I should just sort of check that I'm looking at some of the lists here. So certainly there are 4 non-structural reliefs that cost more than 20 billion a year, which are the zero rating of food, contributions, NICS contributions to registered pension schemes, the income tax related relief on pension schemes, and also private residence relief in CGT. I think we talked a little bit about the extent to which we have not formally evaluated the pensions tax reliefs so far, and Jonathan has mentioned food. Are you also looking at the structural reliefs on your list of 9?
Sorry, I'm going to have to go for the...
Oh, sorry.
No.
Don't worry. The next largest reliefs in my list are around construction and sale of new dwellings, temporary reduced rate of VAT for hospitality, domestic fuel and power, and then we get on to research and development tax credits, which we have indeed done some evaluation work on. So, and I did mention to you that we are also in the process of further evaluation work, and there's about 10.
What are your overall conclusions? I mean, feel free to send us more information in writing about your reflections, but are there any headline points and insights that you want to share with us? And do they still justify their original reasons for existence?
So I would say a lot of those very big reliefs still do. They were done for either, as I said, uncontested policy reasons, but often I think some of the issues we get around the smaller reliefs. So I think sometimes size is not always a particularly useful indicator, and as you will know, the pensions tax relief and kind of where that should start and stop is an area of ongoing policy development where there have been changes, and the Institute for Fiscal Studies, for example, have come forward with some of their proposals about how they would change some of those reliefs. So that is an area where I think it's not necessarily that we haven't necessarily got the evaluation, but it's an area of active policy development.
Just turning to businesses, your forecast for 2022 to 23 capital allowances for businesses, which allow for businesses to set the cost of depreciation of plant and machinery against taxable profits, mean that the UK forecasts about 24.8 billion of revenue every year. Is this part of a global corporate tax race? And how much do you look at other jurisdictions to see how they're using tax reliefs?
So certainly there is a healthy interchange of ideas internationally. What we are talking about with those additional reliefs is where businesses have invested. They are allowed to, under current rules or previous rules, they're allowed to write off some of that investment over time. What has happened is this is an area of again, policy debate and development,
Yep.
and this is where some of the changes announced in the spring budget will make that more generous. But there is an ongoing conversation about internationally where should the overall level of tax should be, and then what reliefs should you allow? Should you allow? Do you go for a slightly higher rate but allow more reliefs for investment, or do you go for a lower rate and have lower reliefs? So that is the context in which those sort of conversations happen.
Okay. And do you have a view on the closure of the Office of Tax Simplification?
That was a decision for ministers, not for me.
Okay. And Chair, would you like me to pick up the question?